if we think about aggressive wars, aggressors, if it's rational, they should win most of the time. Do aggressors win? And the answer, it comes out that aggressors have a 50% chance of winning. That is not a very sensible way of deciding on war. Okay, and most of the successes are sharks against minnows.
Michael Mann, you're a distinguished professor of sociology at UCLA, and you're very well known for your volumes on the sources of social power. And you have a book that is just out on wars. I believe it just came out this October, and you were in Essex a few weeks ago giving a talk on it, which I found really fascinating. And perhaps I could start by asking you if you could tell us, how did you got interested in this topic of wars, and what led you to this topic from your intellectual journey?
Well, there are really two parts of my answer. The first is that having completed the fourth volume of the Sources of Social Power and looking back on it, I realized that though I had stressed military power as one of the four sources of social power, actually had paid almost no attention at all to what militaries do, kill people in battles and out of battles. And so I thought I ought to turn to what militaries do, how wars are caused and how they proceed, and looking at a wide selection of wars right across the world. But the second part of my argument is that there are some sociologists who really study themselves, and that is that an African-American sociologist will study African-Americans, etc., and people of uncertain sexual identity will study that problem. And I am more like social anthropologists who study people who are not like them, who study alien ways of life. Now, my only experience of war, and understandably I don't remember it, is that I was born during a German air raid on Manchester in 1942, and in the basement of a hospital while a raid was going on, so my family tell me. Now, that's my last experience of war, and so I wanted to study something that was alien to me in order to try and understand it. And so that's the second thread, as it were.
I hope that neither you or I will have the experience of war during our lifetime. Perhaps we could come to that topic later on what are your thoughts or prediction that what will happen in my lifetime in the next perhaps 50 years. While reading your book, I think that I could kind of identify the puzzle, and maybe you can guide me on this, is that war is costly, dangerous, and often fail. The objectives of war often fail, but countries, states, and leaders still engage in war. Am I correct? Is that one of the puzzle driving your book?
Yes, that's quite correct. I'd go a bit further than you did and say that wars are predominantly irrational. So the question of why they happen becomes ever more important and difficult.
So perhaps before we go into details about what is a war, perhaps before we go into the topic of rationality, you have a specific definition of war in your book. Perhaps you could start by telling us exactly what is the conceptualization of a war.
Well, war is when large bodies of people, almost always men, together and are organized together and engage in combat with others. Now, political scientists have got a big data set they use where they have a specific definition of war. That war is defined as a combat in which at least 1,000 people die or killed in a year. And one of the things that I say is that is a serious undercount of colonial wars, which consist of a whole series of smaller skirmishes in which, in the end, 1,000 people do, but not in necessarily in battle, and certainly not at one point in time. And this is important because the neglect of colonial wars makes one, it tends to make one think that war was declining through the 19th and early 20th century, which is false. Now, so I don't want to have a statistically bounded conception of war, but and I deal more with wars between different communities or states, more than I deal with civil wars. Civil wars are, of course, important.
But does the wars that you have studied necessarily imply some form of states, or do you exclude hunter-gatherer sort of warfare, tribal warfares and situation of the sort of pre-industrial, pre-agricultural warfare?
Well, I actually would take issue with that, because it's my reading of the archaeological and anthropological literature that were really no wars, or extremely few wars. To be more precise, anthropologists and archaeologists have concluded that Australian indigenous peoples, Aborigines and Torres Islanders, that they did engage in interclan battles, but anthropologists studying the rest of the world haven't found that, or they've found only kind of ritual combats in which two groups assemble, shout abuse, throw spears, and when there's a casualty, they stop. And I think that wars which kill serious numbers of people start when states start, and social stratification and gender stratification. And these are, they start just before recorded history, but not long before.
And now, this makes me think about Steve Pinker's book on violence, and if I remember correctly, he does argue that the hunter-gathering societies were more violent in terms of share of the population that would die, and so you would disagree with that view?
Yes, and in fact, that view is very controversial, but it's very rare. We have a conception called pristine civilizations, which are the first developments of urban settlement states, etc. So are uninfluenced by pre-existing states. And in those, there are 6 agreed cases. In 3 of those, there's no record of war at all over at least 1,000 years, and no pictorial representations of it. Almost very few doomed corpses with violence, signs of violence on skeletons, and a lot of those have their hands bound behind them, so they are either criminals or ritual sacrifices rather than war casualties. Now that's 3 of the 6. The other 3 do develop wars, that is Sumer, Egypt and China, but not apparently in their very first phases. So there's I think a solid amount of evidence that wars really start with civilization.
So you mentioned before the word state. I think this is a very important sociological concept. Would you mind perhaps telling us a little bit more? So what is a state, and what is your sociological understanding of the state? So we know that for Marxists, the state is the expression of class struggles. How do you understand sociologically states and their role in war?
Well, states are centralized institutions which do have 2 main functions, one of which is to manage collective resources in the first civilizations, to develop systems of weights and measures and monetary value, etc., and the other storehouses for surplus agricultural produce, and the other is defense and war. But I kind of have reservations about that, because the actors in political science discussions of war are states. Right? Now, I think that's very misleading, because the actors are actually rulers and their entourage. So a body of people who claim to be the state and who identify themselves with the state. That's one thing. And the second thing is there is a substantial amount of guerrilla warfare and non-state warfare going on in the world at the moment, in the Horn of Africa, for example. So there isn't only interstate wars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is also a fascinating sort of point. Who decides to go to war and who has the power to launch the war machine? And perhaps I could ask you, how did that change over time? Is there a constant pattern to this?
Well, once you have the development of civilizations, then it changes not all that much. I have to qualify that, because obviously the technology of warfare changes enormously through time, and revolutions, if you like to call it that, where, for example, pastoralists develop horse riding into cavalry, and using composite bows become formidable areas, able to inflict defeats on major civilizations like China. And obviously in the last 2 centuries, there's been exponential growth in the killing capacity of wars, and now we have weapons that could destroy the earth. So in that respect, there is big technological change. There's also major change in the size of armies, which have got bigger and which involve, because societies have become bigger and bigger, and so conscription yields far more soldiers than in the past. There's all of those things. But at the same time, warfare has been surprisingly constant in terms of its aims, the motives of the people who make it, the consequences, and that I found rather surprising. We can talk about those.
Would you like to go maybe now into some of these motives that are repeated in history?
Yes, well, historians tend to emphasize they have a dual theory of the aims of war. On the one hand, there's economic, search for economic gains, from which there is a kind of strategic offshoot. You might seek to get secure of a strategic port, a city, not that it's got great value at the moment, but it's strategic economic. And leaders generally go to war expecting some economic return. And indeed, in pre-historical societies, they knew they had to win and bring back gains to distribute among their followers in order to survive. That's one major motive. The second major motive is they say is honor, and status, and glory, and that's what rulers seek. And we think of Putin wanting to be the new Peter the Great.
Yeah,
it is not an economic motive. That is something else.
I did like a lot your chapter on Rome. I did think that it was very interesting. So one thing that you do at the beginning of the book is laying down the different theories, and I think you show quite convincingly that Roman ethos of militarism, some sort of almost like a culture of war, at some point started to take over simple, either defensive wars or even wars for economic gains. I guess this is very sociological. This is suddenly this dimension of prestige being a motivation for wars.
Yes. And as an offshoot of that, I've said what historians think. I think also that the desire for domination in itself is a major attribute of rulers. That is, they enjoy it. They enjoy being powerful, feared, or revered, and they think of war as the principal means for establishing domination. And indeed, if you think about all of the civilizations that we know of, the large-scale civilizations that we know of, they were all established by conquest, not just Rome. Which, if we think in our own times, the European empires, now the American empire, they were established by war. And it's not that civilization is something that is merely an intrinsic development. It's substantially a development of war. Now, there are some exceptions. There are exceptions of groups of city-states, like Sumer in its first, Mesopotamia in its first centuries, or Greece, classical Greece. And they are a little different. But the vast majority of what we call civilizations, we should also call empires achieved by war.
So, but for you, these desire for domination and glory, that's irrational. Or what is the criticism of rationality in this framework?
Well, if we think about Weber's two kinds of rationality, instrumental, which is obvious, that is, you're in it for some material gain. You calculate accordingly. The other one is value rationality, where you are committed to some goal as an absolute in itself, and as something which it therefore undermines instrumental rationality. Now, I think that both of these are involved in war. The latter has been underestimated. And what I do is I end up with a list of non-material motivations for war, or sorry, not motivations, causes of war. What is behind the aggressive act, and as well as material gain and strategic value, that there is ideology. There have been notable ideological wars like World War II, the 30 Years' War in Europe, emotions, and ideology and emotions are really what human beings need, because we lack certain scientific knowledge of the world and of the meaning of life, etc. Ideologies emerge, which are really gods of the gaps, which fill in the knowledge of scientific knowledge. You can't prove that socialism would be a more viable future form of society, but millions of people have believed that it might well be, and were willing to struggle for it. And that's true with all of the major ideologies of human history. But also emotions fill in that gap as well. That is, the emotion of hatred for the enemy, whatever it is, or belief in your own racial superiority over the other group. Ideology and emotions together kind of fill in the gaps and give supposed explanations for why we should go to war. But as well as that, there's domestic politics. That is, many rulers have gone to war for domestic reasons in order to prove that they're strong. Or they do it to divert attention from domestic struggles. And then, as well as that, there's the baking in of culture and institutions. You mentioned Rome. Boys were reared with the assumption that they would go into battle, and they were all conscripted at some point. And in order to have any political office, you had to have had experience in war. And the consuls at the top of this were the ones who, well, one of them was in charge of the war. And so it's permeated by militarism. And in their struggle with the Carthaginians, which I detail, The Carthaginians were not. They were more, well, they were militarists. That is, they had formidable navies, and they hired mercenaries for their soldiers. But they were more oriented towards commercial strategy, towards kind of economic. They were unwilling to commit as much of their resources to war as the Romans did, and the Romans were often defeated in war. The Roman legions were not invincible; they were often defeated. But their reaction to that was to recruit more legions and to carry on fighting, and they had more stomach for war than all of the others around.
I just want to come back a little bit more about the issue of ideology, emotion, and again, rationality. Because even though it is not possible to predict exactly how a theory will play out, I feel that even though if some assumptions are credible, a socialist revolution with this or that assumption about human nature, about social system and so on, would work, I would feel that we could still say that it is rational because there is a process of thinking, building, which is perhaps I can't really imagine how a war could be irrational. Irrational would be something that is really not thought through at all, and that is very rapidly, a decision that is very, very rapidly made and so on. But it seems that the state apparatus is always so big that it would prevent this. Of course, rulers can have wrong assumption, but would necessarily this means that it is irrational? Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that?
I develop tests of both. Political science realism is the dominant theory. That involves substantial calculation, rationality. The two main forms comes aggressive and defensive. And aggressive is where you are the aggressor. I mean, obviously, many wars are not simply aggressive wars or defensive wars. They come about through a series of escalations, etc. But if we think about aggressive wars, now, aggressors, if it's rational, they should win most of the time. Right? Obviously, everyone makes mistakes and things, and as Clausewitz said, war is a gamble, inherently a gamble. And Napoleon said, you don't know what's on the other side of the hill. But they should. Well, political scientists have got this data source of war since 1816, a large number, and you can use their data to see, do aggressors win? And the answer, there have been 4 studies of it, and they come to slightly different conclusions. But if you average them out, it comes out that aggressors have a 50% chance of winning. That is not a very sensible way of deciding on war. Okay, and most of the successes are sharks against minnows, which is typically the case in imperial wars. The British have such military superiority over local African tribes that they're going to win if they put enough resources into it. So that's aggressive warfare. And then if you look at wars that are pre-modern, like I've looked at the Song dynasty in China, they involve in aggressive wars 6 times. They win in 2. Okay, So it doesn't look as if the calculation is all that effective. Now, defensive realism is based on the notion that rulers rationally pursue survival, and that therefore they will always respond to perceived threats with war to defend themselves. Well, the problem of that is, if they rationally pursue survival, why do so few states survive? So in Chinese history, there were, at the very beginning of the Zhou dynasty, there were at least 70 states, 70 plus states. You end up with one after a series of wars. In Japan, in the 15th, 16th century, early 16th century, you had 200 plus statelets. You end up with one. Europe in the Middle Ages had 300 plus states. You end up with about 30. So the vast majority of states do not survive. So it's difficult to see defensive realism as having all that much role to play.
So these wars, in the context of the Sharks War, the odds of success must be higher in these wars. Are
Yes.
these wars more rational?
Oh, yeah. Yes, if there are easy pickings. The problem that you've got to worry about, and why sharks don't always win, it is that well, the major problem is that the minnow may have allies. You think, or the minnows you may have underestimated them. Think about those two things in relation to the Ukraine war. Though the US is faltering now, it was propping up the Ukrainians without the loss of a single American life.
But if Putin would win this war, would that mean that it was a rational decision in the end? Does the end makes up the rationality ad hoc?
Well, what has to go into the equation is a number of things. On what are the likely chances of winning? 2, what gains do you get if you do win? And 3, what's the cost, the economic cost? And the 4th, what's the cost in terms of lives? Now, rulers are not risking their own lives in general, so that one, forget about that one. But at what point, clearly Putin would regard, he could declare the holding of the present territories that they have as a success. I mean, it's not the success he imagined in the first place, but yes, he could do that. But it's by being the 5 different criteria of any cost-benefit analysis, you realize how complex it is and how difficult it is. And in general, rulers have very little knowledge of the enemy. It's the dark side of Durkheim, is what I call it. Durkheim, normative groups depend on normative solidarity, quite right. But the dark side of that is that you have faith in your own community, but you are ignorant of the ones around you. And time and time again, we see rulers overestimating their own power in relation to the enemy. And that's what leads the aggressive wars to disaster.
I mean, it seems to me that a realist like John Mearsheimer has repeatedly made a pretty good rational defense from Russia's point of view. especially that Russia's intervention in Georgia was successful. Putin had a very already strong support from his population, and that probably a war will not destabilize that. Probably Putin also knew that the economy could be somehow saved with China in order. So I think that it is absolutely true that there are uncertainties and there is a sense of, obviously, of a small part that is perhaps emotional or irrational. But is it in your view more either rational or irrational, or it is different things that sum up really in an equation? There are some economic gains, there are some security gains, there are some honor gain, and so on and so forth.
Yes, I have no problem with that. Of course, Putin's ability to define success is very much a consequence of his ruthless elimination of all organized opposition over quite a long period of time, so that this war in a society in which there was more organized opposition might well have resulted by now in Putin's overthrow. But there isn't any opposition. Right? The loss of life has been considerable. The decline of the economy has been quite considerable. Not as it wasn't as severe. It's not as severe as Westerners had first said it would be. But in most societies, this will not be defined as success.
I mean, perhaps you feel free not to answer this question if it's too controversial, but do you think that Ukraine's decision to defend himself was rational? Or they could have actually perhaps accepted a defeat? And in all these criteria, did they overestimated the West's commitment to fight Russia?
Well, you've got to view this sequentially. Okay, the Russians invade, and they do so very badly. And if you remember, what happened there was this advance in the north, which was botched and got stuck. And then there was an attempt to drop paratroopers on the airport to Kiev, and that was supposed to seal off any help coming for the Ukrainians from abroad. And initial resistance, which is what militaries do, is, in Poland in 1939 tries, and they stop the Russians. They kill the paratroopers. And so, that emboldens them. And then, NATO and the United States offer support, lots of support. And so sequentially, it's oversimple to say at a single point in time there is a rational or irrational decision made. You have to see it as a sequence of events. And as you pointed out about Putin and Russia, he had a series of successes behind him. And if you succeed, that makes you more likely to do it again. So it's the answer is, with hindsight, yes, ultimately Ukraine may have overestimated the continuity of American support. We'll see. But they're going to, Putin's intent was to incorporate the whole of Ukraine. And that's not very likely.
I mean, here there is two directions, and one direction I would like to come back after that. It's about what is success, because it seems that this can also be negotiated interestingly. But before that, I just wanted to ask you a little bit, perhaps from the perspective of the United States. And here I'm thinking about the commentary of Noam Chomsky and just replacing the whole support of Ukraine from the United States. And what is interesting here is, do you think that the United States overestimated their power in defeating Russia? And especially that it seems that there is a bit of a pattern here. US intervention or US support that seems to have early success and then drag on, and then in the end basically never really lead anywhere. Do you think that, what was the rationality or irrationality behind the United States getting involved here?
I think that American ideology is quite important in that we are the guarantor of freedom across the world, and it's up to us to keep both communism and then authoritarian regimes at bay. And I think it does need a powerful ideology for the obvious reality of American failure in war to strike home. I mean, after all, Korea was a draw, Vietnam was a terrible defeat, Iraq and Afghanistan turned out as I had predicted in my book Incoherent Empire, turned out very badly. The only victories are against real minnows, like Panama, Grenada. So this is a lamentable record.
So do you?
But of course, it's really ideology plays a substantial role in that, and that is it underestimated the power of communist ideology, communist nationalist ideology, and of Islamic, and it's in a way a typical overestimation of your own capacity in relation to the enemy.
So do you still? So interestingly, now I was thinking where you're saying this, that overall, do you think that the U.S. empire has been weakened by this intervention, and not, even though they have been defeated successively, these wars did still not help the U.S. empire take place, still in Korea or even in Cuba or all over Latin America? Although they lost, they still, perhaps in their view, prevented communism to win, which that in itself, perhaps in the view of Americans, is a win.
That's the way that, with hindsight, a lot of Americans have seen it, yes. But it's making life so unpleasant for quote, communist regimes in Korea and then in Vietnam, to take those two as examples, that no one else is going to want to follow that path. But that wasn't the initial goal. That's the rationalization afterwards. Not merely afterwards, but after a period of time, go for the kind of complete devastation, bombing, and in order to deter others, and in Cambodia as well. And so, I mean, it makes some kind of ghastly sense, but it wasn't seen like that in the first place.
It seems that, I mean, some wars, perhaps on that framework, are more rational than others, because it seems that, for instance, the war in Iraq is perhaps a case of really a difficult one to find a rationality behind.
Yes, yes.
Hmm.
And it wasn't oil. It wasn't oil. The oil
Hmm.
companies weren't interested.
Hmm.
Yes. Uh,
I mean, here also, just to come back to the what is a defeat. I mean, this is also quite fascinating. I was researching a bit Vietnam War, and if you search a little bit who won the Vietnam War, it's quite interesting that always, obviously, without having studied that history so deeply, I was like, okay, the US lost. But it is quite interesting to see that there is not an official loss or, some sort of like treaty, like, okay, the US lost. And it seems that a lot of the losses, even in Afghanistan or Iraq, or the countries who made war can still somehow repackage what happened to present it as a victory. And I feel that in the case of Ukraine, at some point, perhaps even both sides could claim victory. How does that play, this sort of not cut straight, cut winners and losers in a war, plays in the theory of
yeah.
war?
Yes. Well, my analysis of aggressive wars is only of one type of war. I think that the vast majority of wars do not produce the desired results. Results anticipated in the first place. And powers have to settle with a lot less.
Mm-hmm.
There are other things at play as well. Through a fair amount of history, political rulers have feared their generals, and they take steps to reduce the autonomous power of militaries. And you can see in the Middle East this still happens. Saddam, the Egyptian regime, and others, they develop these paramilitary forces, and you see it going haywire in the Sudan. The paramilitary forces are a protection, supposedly a protection for the regime itself against military coups. And that was often true in previous history. The Persian Empire fell to the Mongols, principally because the Persian ruler divided his military up into a lot of smaller units in different cities, and the Mongols took them one by one. And so you got forces within the militaries and within the relationship with rulers that add to the kind of complexity of it. So what may be politically rational turns out to be militarily irrational, as in the case of Saddam Hussein.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the reasons for that wars are not rational kind of vary from war to war. If you think of those American wars, they put a substantial amount of resources into Vietnam, into Korea and Vietnam, and didn't achieve victory. But in Afghanistan and Iraq, they did achieve victory in the field, but they had no political afterplan. Right? And this is obviously going to be the problem that the Israelis will face. And they can win this war using the terrible strategy that they've taken, military strategy that they've taken. But then what? All these rock throwing kids are going to be the next wave of in quotes, terrorists. So it's very often a political underestimation.
Mm.
Many of the neocons expected that the Iraqis would welcome democracy, American-style democracy. And maybe they would welcome democracy, but not American-dominated.
Mm. It's almost as if the political, the afterwards of war, to win a war has to be political solutions, political continuity. Perhaps
Yes.
that's why the end of Second World War, in a way, was successful for the peace in Europe, because there was some afterthought about how to treat the defeated Germany. I don't know.
Yes. Well, World War II was a case of aggression slightly provoked in the Japanese case by the Roosevelt administration. But the other countries had to take the choice of, well, do we submit or do we fight? And Russia had its size, and Britain had its channel, and America was untouchable. So they took on more. Germany, Italy, Japan, they took on more than they could succeed for ideological reasons. And they had an ideology themselves, which they said that the martial spirit of their soldiers, because of the ideology involved, could outweigh inferiority of numbers and technology.
Perhaps could I ask you a little bit more about theories? And I mean, probably the theory I'm the most familiar with is realism. But for me, it's not entirely clear how would you call your theory? What is your theory? Then you mentioned liberalism and constructivism. How would you define your theory? Are you a constructivist? And perhaps just also continue here, because so the ideology are very much sort of cultural sort of traits that this make me think about Huntington theory and sort of Huntington's sort of views of the importance of cultures. And it's quite fascinating. I'm rereading actually on Huntington Clash of Civilization, and he discussed very much his prediction against realist prediction. And he mentioned that Ukraine is a country that is culturally divided, and what Ukraine needs to do is to make peace with the Russian and so on. And very interestingly, Mersheimer himself says that no, Russia and Ukraine will go to war in the future, and Ukraine needs to retain its military, its nuclear arsenals. So could you talk a little bit about where do you position yourself in these different theories that you talk about?
Well, first of all, in normative terms, I think realism would be the best theory, because there would be a lot fewer wars if rulers really did rationally calculate the odds of making gains from war. And since there are normally no gains, then over a tiny handful of people, then there would be a lot fewer wars. So my normative sympathies are with realism, but not in terms of real analysis. Well, constructivism tends to be a little too cultural for my liking, and also it tends to be associated with peace. And so is not, I haven't seen any really convincing constructivist accounts of wars. Well, I'm sociological. I'm not sure what more I can say in that respect. I try and look at the balance of power, the motivations of the people involved, and the military resources, and try to come to conclusions. I think that my stress on ideology is obviously compatible with constructionism. Liberalism is, well, of course, all of these theories have been mainly applied to the contemporary world. And so globalization, the United Nations, international law, gradually emerging, etc. But it's not really been used in terms of historical analysis. And so I think that I'm not sure how to label myself. It's an interesting question.
But I feel that you do not like Huntington very much. Could you perhaps touch on this? You don't discuss him so much in your books. I was quite actually surprised. Why is it so?
Well, I have to confess, it's a long time since I read Huntington. By that you mean The Clash of Civilization. And of course, he then wrote a book about the Latino threat to America, which didn't endear him to me anymore. Well, I found that well, he was well, these civilizations, these very broad civilizations, seem to me to be a bit arbitrary, and he put too much of the blame for the kind of Middle Eastern wars with Western imperialism onto Islam, and which has been conventional among Americans, but I think is kind of false. That you have to see it in the context of the Western powers, and then Russia, the Soviet Union, and Russia meddling in the Middle East, and so that some forms of possible regime for them were tarred very much by being identified with either the United States or with Russia, the Soviet Union. So I didn't think that his analysis was very profound.
Interesting. Perhaps with everything you have learned, and with your sociological theory, where do you think we are, heading? Do you think that China-US is the next big war? And you think, if so, if we don't live in a realist world, then what can be done to avoid another massive world war?
Well, nobody can predict what's going to happen between China and the United States. Some things look quite bad. That is that Americans are beginning to accept China's growing power, and China clearly, one thing I say in my book is that they are trying to reestablish the boundaries of imperial China, that all of their aggression at the moment is focused on recovering things which used to belong to the Chinese Empire, including the South China Sea, domination of the South China Sea. Now, will they go on any further? Well, if they have success there, they might well, but who knows? I think, I've changed my views considerably on the question of nuclear deterrence. It is a deterrent as long as it's possessed by states, and it helps if there's only two, because they can clearly see the other one has these weapons too, and let's stop short of that. It did work in the post-World War II period. They fought indirectly through client states, and not good news for the client states, but they kept well away from war. There were no cases where American troops confronted Russian or Soviet troops. So that's the main hope. Of course, there is also the kind of the increasing interdependence of the American economies. Of course, that didn't stop World War I, which was preceded by increasing interdependence of British economies. So it's perfectly possible for surging patriotism and anger to overpower economic interdependence, I think. After all, we're learning continuously in the United States that people don't vote in terms of their economic interest. So, I don't know. It's a problem for your generation. I don't think it'll be a problem for me. I think we can rely on peace for another 10 years.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the decline of the American empire will lead to more peace because there will be more balance of power, or will lead to more aggression by the United States or the great power to try to keep this status. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not one who thinks that American power is significantly declining. I think that the power of the dollar as a reserve currency is inventiveness, the American economy are going to keep America up there for some time. Now, the problems of America are a little different. Internal politics is in a really serious crisis, and there are people who think that if, I think many observers think that if Trump is elected president with a Republican majority in the two houses, that there will be significant encroachments on democracy, and that will lead to to kind of fighting in the streets. On the other hand, China doesn't have to deal with those problems because it's a completely authoritarian state, and democracy has, in some ways, more problems than authoritarianism. But I mean, obviously, in terms of the Pacific, the US is quite dependent on its allies across the ringing to China. but the kind of flashpoint of Taiwan is something that is rather unpredictable. So I'm very good at predicting the past. I'm not so great at predicting the future.
I never heard that quote. That's good. That's good. So in your view, you think that Europe should stay allied with the United States and not go a Charles de Gaulle sort of way of the Europe basically becoming an independent power?
Well, Europe is an economic power, but militarily, no. As long as Russia is aggressive, and if it wins in the Ukraine, if Putin wins in Ukraine, that won't be the end of it. And Europe is not equipped for self-defense. Even the Franco-German brigade hasn't achieved real existence, which it was supposed to be the first kind of, close cooperation between the armed forces of European states. And of course, Europe is quite divided. Some of the eastern states have ambivalent feelings about Russia and don't want to go to war with Russia. And Britain is no longer a part of the European Union. So I don't think that if Russian leaders continue to be aggressive, that Europe has any choice other than seeking American protection.
So maybe to finish, Michael, may I ask you what is your next big topic? Where are you going from wars?
I don't know. I've been asked to write a piece on reflections on the sources of social power, which I am just beginning to do. And after that, I don't know, into a more theoretical book, but I don't know that I have the capacity to do that. I'm a very empirical kind of guy.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your time. I enjoyed your book a lot. And it was really nice talking to you.